Welcome to the Sharing Grace podcast, a ministry of Church at Viera on the Space Coast of Florida. The mission of Church at Viera is to share grace with everyone and see Christ change lives. Our desire is to empower faith and build community through engaging conversations, inspiring testimonies, and practical answers to life's questions. Let's jump into today's conversation.
Thanks for tuning in to the Sharing Grace podcast and joining in the conversation today is Mark Ragsdale, our lead pastor of Church at Viera, and Jay Austin, our discipleship pastor, and Carrie Thompson. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. You lead our impact ministry here, and we're so grateful for what you do for our church and what you do for our community and around the world. And for those of you that don't know, my name's Brandon. I'm the executive pastor here, and Carrie, we're excited about our new initiative we're in. We call it 4-3-2-1. It's a name we came up with a couple years ago, and it really sticks. For our podcast listeners, can you help us understand the meaning behind the name and the purpose behind the vision and the initiative?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple years ago, I read a book by Jeffrey Henderson called 4. And the premise of the book was, what do you want to be known for? And so what do I want to be known for in my personal life? And then I transferred that to, what do I want this ministry to be known for? And so many times Christians and even churches are known for what we don't stand for or what we're not for. And what we just really stand against. But what if we flipped the script and we became known by what we are for? So we're for truth, we're for grace, we're for compassion, love, generosity, and kindness. What if we became known for those things as individuals and as a church?
That's good.
And so what do I want our community to experience when they bump into someone from Church at Viera? I want them to experience truth, grace, kindness.
That's good.
And so we're on the Space Coast of Florida.
Yep.
Our area code is 321. And so our hope was that 321 would be known for those things. So that's how we came up with 4-3-2-1.
It's great.
Love it.
I think we have the coolest area code, don't you?
It definitely is.
It's name a better area
Catchy.
code than 321.
We're launching. We're launching.
We're
a lot.
launching. Yes.
That's so good. So, Mark, this weekend you talked about generosity. You challenged us on generosity and specifically in the area of our finances. And one of our CAV values is that we generously release our resources back for the purpose of God. That gives us focus on what we're going to do with our money. It's not just about giving. And so as a church, we talk about generosity, and some people get excited and like they have the gift of giving and they see how God is using their gifts. Other people are like, oh no,
Yes.
not again.
Yeah.
And so generosity is about releasing the resources. But why do you think that it's important for us to talk about finances as a church and even to bring some of that tension into play?
Yeah.
Well, we hope to get everybody in that first group that they're excited about it. But really, it comes down to fear, I think. It comes down to until you learn to trust God and what He tells us to do, and that's the best way, you have this fear, first of all, that am I going to have everything I need if I give some away? And then number two, it comes down to your dreams and your desires. Am I going to have FOMO? Am I going to have a fear of missing out because everybody else is getting to do stuff, but because I'm giving away, I can't do those things? And I think it really comes down to faith. Do you really trust that if you do things God's way, that's going to bring the biggest blessings, the greatest joy, and all the things that God promises? So I think that's where the tension comes in. It is a step of faith when you are generous to give away, believing you will receive back.
That's good. And don't you feel like we have a responsibility to talk about it because Jesus talked about it, right? When Jesus talked about the area of finances in a lot of areas that bring tension, right? So think about some of the things that Jesus taught about. He talked about loving your enemies. That brings tension. Anytime we talk about things that Jesus talked about, that changes the way we might behave will always bring some tension. He talked about forgiving others who have hurt you. That brings some tension. He says, do everything you can to live at peace with everyone. That brings tension. So I think when we talk about things that change, that have a that that encourages us to change our behavior, that will always bring tension.
So it's the tension is obviously there, and it's not natural for us to want to move into the things that God would have us do. But when we do, we actually see how He was created, how those things have been created for a purpose. And so we go from being conformed to the way of thinking to a transformational way of thinking, and there's life that comes from that and freedom that comes in that.
Yeah, it's good.
It's good.
Yeah. Well, Mark, I loved your warning label illustration, how you kicked off the message so good. The passage that you connected the dots for us was Luke chapter 12, verse 13. It says, watch out, there's the warning, be on guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. You called greed a sneaky sin in your sermon. Why do you think Jesus goes really hard against greed in our lives?
If you think about greed, I think greed is something that we think if we hoard, if we keep for ourselves, if we just focus on acquiring ourselves, it's going to enhance our life, it's going to expand ourselves, we'll have more opportunities, all those kind of things. But really what greed does is it diminishes you. And I think that's why Jesus is so hard on it. He doesn't want to see us diminished.
Yeah.
It shrivels your soul up when you're just focused on yourself and when you're just focused on the things you want. It really does shrivel up your soul.
Yeah.
And so love is the only thing that really truly expands your soul. And the more we love God and love others by helping to help God help others, then He's able to enlarge our life through love. So those are just some of my thoughts.
Yeah, that's good. People who struggle with greed, what I've seen, even in my own life, in specific areas, struggle with being content. Right? You've used this illustration, and you've used it in the past as well, calling it the more monster. And when I think of that more monster, I think of the Broadway play, the movie, The Little Shop of Horrors. Have you all seen that? I think the plant's name was Audrey or Audrey 2, something like that. And it was only fed by human blood, right? And it every time you gave it human blood, it wanted more, and it would grow, and it would grow, and it would grow. And when I think of greed and the lack of contentment in our lives, I think of that plant. And we have to starve that in our lives because, as you say, there's so much more waiting for us beyond that greed in our lives. So
I just think that we, as kind of middle class America, we live sometimes with this scarcity mindset. Like, I just have to hoard this and collect it, and I don't want to give it all away. And yet, that's an invitation. I recently got to spend time in Kenya, and among some of the poorest people, I think people who have less than us often give us more than we could ever give to them in return. Like, so here I am sitting in the middle of this African small community. They have nothing, but what do they serve us? They serve us food. They're bringing us gifts. They have nothing, and yet they're willing to give.
Yep.
Why don't I live like that here? I have an abundance, but I'm afraid to release all of this.
Yeah.
Sometimes we need that perspective.
It's good, Carrie.
So, Mark, you mentioned the phrase blessing hogs in your message this weekend. Can you explain a little bit more about what that means to our listeners?
Sure. My good friend Sandy Hawk coined this phrase. She's a very giving person. And it goes off of that scripture where Jesus says it's more blessed to give than to receive. That's Acts 20. And a lot of people don't get it, but really the more you give, the more you get back. The more you refresh others, Scripture says, the more you'll be refreshed. And so really what Sandy is saying is she has just discovered that the more she shares her blessings with others, she becomes a blessing hog. She's getting more back. It's kind of like that investment. Maybe that company or stock that you find it really bringing you a great return on investment, and you just keep investing and it just keeps giving you great dividends or whatever. Well, the more you're generous and giving to other people, it's going to come back to you.
It's great.
In ways you never imagined, and you almost become a blessing hog. That's really kind of
That's good.
what it means.
So how else have you guys seen how that blessing has happened in your own life where you can't be out blessed? Yeah.
For me, personally, it's the joy of seeing a person receive a gift, if you have the opportunity to give generously and you see the person's look in their eyes when it really means a lot to them, that is worth more than anything, right? Or the joy of seeing how a gift that I have been able to give, or my family's been able to give over time, has helped, not in the short season, but in the long haul. Oh, look at where that person is today because of how we were able to invest in them early. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I just love seeing the joy in the recipient. Yeah.
My parents have modeled this so well from really the time I was a teenager and can remember they have the gift of giving, and so they would just routinely meet people's needs. And so as their child, as a young adult, as now a middle-aged adult, I've just been able to see how their generosity impacts people's quality of life.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it just simply brings another person joy. Sometimes it moves a person further along in their walk with the Lord
Yeah.
because my parents have met a financial need that somebody was just praying about. And it's been a blessing to see. And then they've modeled that. And so as we try to walk out our faith, I don't think I'm nearly as generous as they are, but it makes me pay attention to those people who are in need. It's created an awareness. It's probably a better way to say it.
You know, there's so many blessings that come from generosity, but I think the biggest one for me is just it enhances your relationships. I mean, you get closer in relationships when you're generous with other people. God so loved that he gave his only son, and because of that, I just fell in love with God that he would give so much for me.
That's good.
In the same way we do that for others, it just really deepens your relationships with other people.
That's really good.
Yeah, there's a piece of this that I learned early in my ministry, and that is we give, but we also need to be good receivers when somebody gives to us, because it brings joy to their hearts.
That's good.
To give to us. And so it's a reciprocating thing. Sometimes we can feel like, well, we're just doing all the giving. And like you said, Carrie, when you're around people who don't have a lot to give, but they give what they have, it's just overwhelming to receive it.
It humbles you.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder, Jay. Let's get really practical for just a moment. It seems like the biggest mistake people make with their money and their resources is not taking the long view, looking at what it might look like down the road. They're not thinking about eternal things which you get to keep instead of temporary things which will leave you. What are some tips, and this is for everybody, what are some tips on how to keep the backdrop of eternity in mind in regards to your present money management? What are some simple tips that we can give to the listeners of this podcast to help them understand, hey, we got to keep eternity in mind when it comes to generosity?
What do you think, Carrie?
And a great mentor of mine would encourage us. I'm just going to choose a random number. Just because you have $100,000 income doesn't mean that you have to live $100,000 lifestyle. And so as the Lord maybe increases our ability to earn money, that's an invitation for us to give more money away. And I've seen that just practically play out in our lives, that living conservatively allows us to give more and more away
Yes.
than to be on the just a blessing hog. You get to see the benefits of being generous.
Yes. You know, two things really help me. One is obviously staying in the scripture, because the scriptures talk about eternity and talk about treasures in heaven and all those things that keep your focus on eternity. But I brought a visual. This is from my office. Years ago when we were dedicating this land and property, we used some stones like Joshua used with the tribes to build an altar. And the altars back then were to help them to remember what God had done for them and God's promises, and that's why he had them build altars. So we built an altar on this property before the building was built, and this is one of the rocks that we use that I keep in my office as a reminder to me that everything I've sacrificed and everything I give to make this campus possible to reach people, it's worth the sacrifice because there are eternal treasures of relationships that will last on forever because of what we did. So this is just one of my reminders in the office.
That's really good.
Wow, that's so good. That's so good. Mine's not quite eternity, but what I've found is that my wife really early on drove us to be givers. I used to be the one who was always like, we're giving of our time. Why do we need to give of our resources? And she was like, nope, let's make sure we're giving the whole of who we are and what God's given us, not just the parts. And in that, my wife and I have been able to really draw close together. And it's been a common purpose in our life to give together. And as a result, our boys have seen us do that, and it's something that they desire to do. So the outcome of that is that there's legacy beyond ourselves
Yeah.
that is outside of our control. So we
Right.
give, not expecting anything in return, and then we get to see the blessing that comes from that.
That's good. Anything you'd add, Brandon?
Mine are really more practical, I think, less spiritual, I guess, so to speak. I mean, those are really good. But it goes back to what you said, Carrie. It's about creating margin in our lives. Most of the time, we don't give because we don't feel like we have margin to give, and so you have to be very intentional. Going back to your word of the year, very intentional in establishing margin in your life so that you can more freely give. And mine are super practical. Like, stop buying stuff that will be a future just tremendous garage sale, right? 3-4 years from now, if it's going to sit on in your garage or sit on your driveway ready to be sold for pennies on the dollar, maybe it's something that you don't need to buy. It'll help you establish margin. One that I just thought of this morning that really I don't like, but it's a good practice is, man, we spend a lot of money on coffee. The average cup of coffee costs $3.
I think I need you to be quiet.
Yeah, you don't like this one, but this one touched a nerve with me as I was reflecting on it, and just being very practical. If you buy 4 cups of coffee a week at $3 a cup of coffee, that's $624 a year that you're spending on coffee. Just think about that. What could that $624, or even just a fraction of it, what could it be used for eternity's sake if I reinvest it back into, or invest it back into something that really truly matters? So the thought there is just make my coffee at home. It's 50 cents for a K-cup. There's some really practical ways that we can do in our lives to create margin so that we can feel more free to give. So just some simple thoughts
That's
there.
good. So the focus is try to think more long-term, eternity-minded things so that you make a difference with what you have here on earth.
Yeah, nailed it.
Carrie, you're doing a fantastic
Yeah,
job
I'm proud of it.
leading our local impact ministries, and you get a front row seat and to see how a lot of the funds that the church gives to help make a difference in the community. I'm just kind of curious if you could tell us a story or two of just how you're seeing our generosity impact local partners that are making a difference in our county.
I could probably take the entire podcast and give you stories, but I chose two. One is with Helen's House. So in Brevard County, homelessness among women and children has really been on the rise. And up until last year, there was not a shelter where women with children could go in really an emergency situation. And that's how Helen's House and the need was birthed. And so, as a church, we were able to sponsor a room. And so, because the church came together and collectively brought all of this generosity to the table, we have a room now at Helen's House where women, at least 2 women and up to 4 kids, can be in a program where they can receive just counseling, shepherding, mentoring, spiritual care. I love Helen's House's mission. It's a safe haven for women and children where grace will restore, train, and transform. That's what our generosity has been doing at Helen's House, and what an impact that will have on just generations to come. We're breaking that cycle of homelessness.
That's wonderful.
That's one. And the second one is really the counterpart to Helen's House is CEDA. That's Christ is the Answer. And that's a place where men who are struggling with all sorts of things, whether that's addiction, whether that's just unhealthy relationships with themselves, with the Lord, they can go and again be a part of a ministry that calls them out and really gives them tools to be able to live a life that's honoring to the Lord. And so one of the people in our church actually was a part of that.
Yes.
And I'm so proud of him and excited for what he's doing. He's been in the program for now 2 years. And recently he has signed up to go on his first impact trip, our missions trip. And so I love that God has just been calling him out to be more than living a life that's just focused on what's here on earth, but he's calling him to think kingdom-minded and then go impact the world.
That's good, Carrie.
Thanks for sharing those stories. I love hearing stories of how we're making an impact.
It inspires. It's an inspiration. Well, Carrie, for the next couple of weeks, we're going to be in this initiative, the 4-3-2-1 initiative. The first week was on giving. Next week is going to be on serving. But we gave the challenge to everyone in our church this last Sunday to give $50
Yeah.
to the initiative, and we don't keep any of those dollars.
No, that's right. It's 100% is given away.
That's good.
And that's the really fun part of my job. I get to go deliver some great checks to these organizations.
Yeah, that are really making a difference in our community. Perhaps there's a listener out there right now that's feeling a nudge. You know what? I can get involved in that. How could they get involved in the 4-3-2-1 initiative, whether it's in the give apparatus or the serve, as we're going to talk about next week?
Yeah. So we have it all listed on the website, churchatviera.com. There's actually a scrolling bar on the very front page where they can go, and if they would like to contribute, they can do that online. There's also the service portion of it, and so we would love to have you be a part of those projects if you're local. But if you're not, go and check out the organizations. You can see the impact these organizations are having in a community. They are experts in their field. We're not necessarily experts in homelessness or how to care for women who are coming out of a trafficking movement, but these organizations work day in, day out, and there's lots of ways to serve those particular organizations.
Perfect. Again, that address, that website is churchatviera.com. It's right on the top of the page.
Yep.
Carrie, thank you guys. Thank you for your input in today's podcast. Mark, thanks for the challenge on generosity. It was a great challenge for all of us. So, Jay, you want to pray us out today?
Yeah, grateful too. God, we thank you for just the few minutes we've had to talk more about generosity and just how you have put so many people in our church that are generous and helping to do things that there's no way that we could do on our own. But when we combine together, we're able to do kingdom-sized work, and we thank you for that connection.
Thank you for listening to the Sharing Grace podcast. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to send us an email to sharinggrace@churchatviera.com. If you don't have a church home, we would love to invite you to join us for one of our 3 Sunday services at 8:30, 10, or 11:30 a.m. You can learn more about Church at Viera by visiting churchatviera.com. If this podcast was helpful to you in any way, please subscribe, write a review, or share it with a friend. This will tremendously help us get the word out about this resource. We look forward to catching up with you next time on the Sharing Grace podcast.